The moon hung low in the sky, veiled by a thin layer of clouds that cast an eerie glow over the desolate highway. The gas gauge in Mia's car dipped below empty, the needle trembling on the edge. She sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter, her eyes scanning the road ahead for a sign of life. Finally, a flickering neon sign appeared through the darkness. Last Stop Gas and Diner. The sign buzzed faintly, the D in diner blinking erratically. A single gas pump stood under a rusty awning, and a small diner with grime-covered windows sat adjacent to it. "This is creepy," Mia muttered, but she had no choice. The next town was over 50 miles away, and her car wasn't going to make it. She pulled up to the pump, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, save for the occasional chirp of crickets. The place seemed abandoned. Even the diner, though its lights were on, had no visible patrons. Mia grabbed her wallet and stepped out, the night air biting against her skin. The pump was ancient, with faded instructions barely legible under years of grime. As she fumbled with it, the sound of a door creaking open caught her attention. From the diner, an old man shuffled out, hunched over and carrying a rag. His face was deeply lined, his eyes shadowed under the brim of a grease-stained trucker cap. "Need some help there?" he asked, his voice gravelly and slow. "No, I'm good, thanks," Mia replied, trying to sound polite but firm. The man gave her an unsettling smile, his yellowed teeth showing briefly, before he turned and disappeared back into the diner. Mia's unease grew as she filled her tank. The pump groaned and hissed as if it were alive, its mechanism struggling to function. She glanced at the diner, its windows murky and streaked with something that looked suspiciously like old blood. Her eyes darted back to the road, her instincts screaming to leave. When the pump finally clicked, she replaced the nozzle hastily. She wanted to leave without stepping inside the diner, but she needed a receipt. Against her better judgment, she pushed open the diner's door. A bell above jingled faintly, its sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness inside. The air reeked of grease and decay, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Booths lined the walls, their red vinyl torn and oozing yellow stuffing. The counter was empty except for an old cash register and a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. "Hello?" Mia called out, her voice trembling slightly. The old man reappeared from the back, his movements unnervingly slow. He wiped his hands on the rag, the motion deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Need something?" he asked, his tone devoid of emotion. "Just a receipt," Mia replied, forcing a smile. The man nodded and began pressing buttons on the cash register. As she waited, Mia noticed something odd. The menu on the wall listed strange items: roadkill stew, mystery meat pie, and bleeding rare burger. Her stomach churned. "It'll do it," the man said, handing her a receipt. His hand lingered slightly too long as their fingers brushed. His skin felt clammy and cold, like something dead. "Thanks," Mia muttered, pulling her hand away quickly. She turned to leave, but a low, guttural growl froze her in place. It came from the back of the diner. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old man's grin widened. "Just the wind," he said, but his eyes gleamed with something dark, something predatory. Mia didn't believe him. She backed toward the door, her heart pounding. Before she could reach it, the growl came again, louder this time. It was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, something large dragging itself across the floor. She turned just in time to see a shadow emerge from the kitchen. It was massive, its hulking frame barely fitting through the doorway. The creature's body was grotesque, a patchwork of mangled flesh and bone. Its face, or what was left of it, was a nightmare of stitched-together features, eyes glowing red in the dim light. Mia screamed, bolting for the door, but the old man was faster than he looked. He grabbed her arm with a strength that didn't match his frail appearance. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, struggling against his iron grip. Now," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's been a while since we've had fresh meat." The creature lumbered closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Mia could feel its hot breath on her neck, a sickly sweet stench that made her gag. Desperate, she kicked the old man in the shin, and he let out a surprised grunt, releasing her just long enough for her to break free. She sprinted to her car, adrenaline fueling her every step. Behind her, the creature let out a deafening roar, and she could hear its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Mia fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door and dove inside. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. Come on," she begged, slamming her hand against the steering wheel. The creature was almost upon her, its massive hands reaching for the car. Just as it slammed against the window, the engine roared to life. Mia floored the gas, the tires screeching as she tore out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, she saw the old man standing under the flickering neon sign, his grin wider than ever. The creature stood beside him, watching her retreat with glowing red eyes. Mia didn't stop driving until she reached the next town. She pulled into a brightly lit gas station, shaking so badly she could barely stand. The attendant inside noticed her pale face and trembling hands. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. "There's something back there," Mia stammered. "At the last stop gas and diner, you have to call the police." The attendant frowned. "Ma'am, there hasn't been a diner out there for years. It burned down in the 80s. Everyone who worked there died in the fire." Mia stared at him, her mind racing. She turned back to look at the road, but it was empty. No sign of the neon sign, the gas pump, or the diner. She never took that highway again. It was a cool October night in 1998 when Mike and his wife, Lisa, were driving back home from a family reunion in rural Pennsylvania. The two-lane highway stretched out in front of them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense, shadowy woods. The moon was high, but offered little light, and the dim headlights of their old sedan struggled to pierce the oppressive darkness. The drive had been uneventful until they realized they were running low on gas. Mike glanced at the fuel gauge, the needle perilously close to E. They hadn't seen a gas station for miles, and the nearest town was still over 30 miles away. Anxiety crept in as they considered the possibility of being stranded in the middle of nowhere. "Do you think we'll make it?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Maybe," Mike replied, gripping the wheel tighter, "but we need to find a gas station soon." As if in answer, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A sign emerged from the darkness, its neon letters flickering. Hollow Creek Gas Rest Stop. Relieved, Mike turned into the gravel driveway leading to the station. The place was small, with a single pump under a weathered metal awning. Adjacent to the pump was a small convenience store, its windows fogged over and coated with grime. The station was eerily quiet. No cars, no people. Just the faint hum of the neon sign and the chirping of crickets in the surrounding woods. "This place looks abandoned," Lisa said, eyeing the darkened windows. "Let's just get gas and go," Mike replied, stepping out of the car. The pump was old, its paint peeling and the numbers on the dial barely visible. Mike reached for the nozzle and froze. The handle was ice cold, and as he gripped it, a strange feeling washed over him, a mix of unease and dread, as if he were being watched. He shook it off and began filling the tank. The gasoline flowed slower than he expected, the pump groaning and rattling as if reluctant to perform its duty. Lisa rolled down the window. "Do you think they even take credit cards here?" Mike glanced toward the store. "I'll go check." As he approached the entrance, The door creaked open on its own. A bell above jingled faintly, its sound almost lost in the heavy silence. The inside of the store was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly and casting long shadows. Shelves lined with dusty products stood like forgotten sentinels, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. "Hello?" Mike called out. His voice echoed eerily. No response. He walked toward the counter, where an old cash register sat covered in cobwebs. A sign taped to the counter read, "Cash only." Behind the counter, a door hung slightly ajar, leading to what looked like a back office. From the darkness beyond, he heard a faint shuffling noise. "Is anyone here?" he asked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He turned to leave, but the sound of something heavy falling in the back room made him stop. His heart raced as he debated whether to investigate or just leave. Curiosity won out. He took a cautious step toward the door. Inside the office, the air was even heavier, almost suffocating. A desk covered in papers and old receipts sat in the corner, and a small window overlooked the woods. On the floor, a large object was wrapped in a filthy, blood-stained tarp. Mike's stomach turned as he realized it was roughly the size of a person. Before he could react, a voice behind him broke the silence. "Looking for something?" Mike spun around. An old man stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. His clothes were filthy, and his hands were streaked with grease or maybe something darker. I just needed gas," Mike stammered, taking a step back. The old man tilted his head, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No, just passing through," Mike replied, his voice shaking. "I'll pay for the gas and be on my way." The old man's grin widened. "No need for payment. Just stay a while." Mike didn't wait for an explanation. He bolted past the man, his heart pounding as he sprinted back to the car. Lisa saw the panic in his face and immediately locked the doors. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just go," Mike yelled, fumbling to get the car started. As the engine roared to life, they saw the old man standing under the awning, his grin still plastered on his face. But he wasn't alone. From the shadows of the woods, figures emerged, dozens of them. Their faces were pale, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. They moved slowly but deliberately, surrounding the car. "Drive," Lisa screamed. Mike floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as the car sped toward the highway. The figures didn't chase them but stood motionless, watching as they disappeared into the night. For miles, neither of them spoke. Mike's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Lisa kept glancing behind them, half expecting the figures to appear in the rearview mirror. Finally, they reached the next town. They pulled into a brightly lit gas station, this one bustling with activity. Mike parked the car and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The attendant noticed their shaken state and approached. "You folks okay?" he asked. "There's something wrong with the gas station back on the highway," Mike said. "Hollow Creek or something." The attendant's face paled. Hollow Creek. That place burned down years ago. Nobody's been there since the fire. Mike and Lisa stared at him, their blood running cold. "That's impossible," Lisa whispered. "We were just there." The attendant shook his head. "You must be mistaken. The whole place went up in flames back in the 70s. The owner and a few travelers didn't make it out. People say it's haunted." Mike and Lisa exchanged a glance, the weight of the truth sinking in. They didn't refuel until daylight from then on. No matter where they were, no matter how low the tank was, they never stopped at another pit stop after dark. Jack and Elena were halfway through their cross-country road trip when the trouble began. It had been Jack's idea to take the scenic route, a winding, lesser-traveled highway cutting through miles of dense, unbroken forest. The road was deserted, the landscape desolate, with only the occasional deer or raccoon darting across their headlights to remind them they weren't entirely alone. But now their gas gauge was dangerously low, the needle hovering just above empty. They hadn't seen a gas station for miles, and Elena was starting to panic. "We should have filled up back in that last town," she said, her voice tense. Jack sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I know. I thought we'd find another one by now." The car's engine sputtered ominously, and Elena gave him a sharp look. Just as Jack was about to admit they might be in real trouble, a sign loomed in their headlights. It was weathered and faded, but the words were clear. Last stop gas, 2 miles ahead. Thank God, Elena muttered. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As they neared the station, unease settled over them like a heavy blanket. The gas station sat in a clearing, the only sign of civilization for miles. A single pump stood under a rusty metal awning, its paint chipped and peeling. The convenience store behind it was dark, save for a flickering neon sign in the window that read, "Open." Jack pulled up to the pump and cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Elena shivered, though the night wasn't particularly cold. "This place is creepy," she said, glancing around. "It's just old," Jack replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He grabbed his wallet and stepped out of the car. The pump was ancient, the kind with a manual lever and a cracked glass display. Jack frowned as he picked up the nozzle. The smell of gasoline was faint, almost non-existent. He flicked the lever, but nothing happened. "Great," he muttered, "out of order." Elena leaned out the window. "What's wrong?" "I'll check inside," Jack said, heading toward the store. The door creaked as he pushed it open, a tinny bell announcing his arrival. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic. Shelves lined with dusty, outdated products stretched into the shadows. A layer of grime coated everything, and the layer of a flickering fluorescent light was the only sound. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice echoing slightly. From the back of the store, a man emerged. He was tall and thin, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken and dark, his smile unnervingly wide. He wore a grease-stained apron and a trucker cap that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. "Need some gas?" the man asked, his voice raspy. Jack said, forcing a smile. "The pump out there isn't working." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Ain't worked in years, but we've got the backup tank. I'll fill you up." Before Jack could respond, the man shuffled past him and out the door. Jack followed, uneasy but desperate to get back on the road. The man walked to a metal drum near the pump and began cranking a handle. Thick, dark liquid sputtered out into the nozzle. Are you sure that's gas?" Jack asked, watching the sludge-like substance fill his tank. "It'll get you where you're going," the man said, his grin never faltering. Jack didn't like the way he said it, but he didn't argue. He just wanted to get out of there. "Pay inside when I'm done," the man added, waving Jack back toward the store. Inside, Elena had gotten out of the car and was leaning against the hood, her arms crossed. "This place is giving me the creeps," she said. "Can we go?" "Just as soon as I pay," Jack replied, heading back inside. The man was behind the counter now, his bony hands resting on the surface. Jack placed a $20 bill down, eager to leave. "Not many people come through here these days," the man said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "It's good to see new faces." Jack forced a polite smile. "Thanks." The man's grin widened. "You take care now. The road ahead gets lonely." Jack didn't reply. He walked out quickly, feeling the man's gaze on his back the entire time. Back in the car, Jack and Elena drove in silence for a while. The headlights carved a path through the darkness, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. The forest pressed in from both sides, the trees like looming shadows. Something felt off. The car's engine sounded different. Lower, almost like a growl. Jack glanced at the fuel gauge. It was still full, but the needle twitched erratically, as if it couldn't decide where to settle. "This is weird," he muttered. "What?" Elena asked, looking up from her phone. "The gas. Something's wrong with it." As if on cue, the engine sputtered, then roared. The car jerked violently, and Jack struggled to keep it on the road. "Ow, the hell!" Elena cried, gripping the dashboard. The headlights flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The car coasted to a stop, the engine dead. Jack turned the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. "This can't be happening," he muttered, slamming his hands against the wheel. Elena grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. "Great! Now what?" Jack looked around. The woods were silent, oppressively so. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. In the distance, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, was a figure. It stood on the side of the road, motionless. At first Jack thought it was a tree stump, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized it was a person. "Elena," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Do you see that?" She followed his gaze and gasped. The figure began to move, slowly shuffling toward them. As it got closer, Jack realized it wasn't walking, it was dragging itself. Its legs didn't bend naturally, and its arms were too long, the hands clawing at the asphalt. "Lock the doors," Jack said, his voice shaking. Elena fumbled with the lock button as the figure reached the car, its face pressed against the driver's side window, pale and grotesque. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth too wide, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. Jack screamed and threw the car into gear, but the engine wouldn't start. The creature began pounding on the window, its clawed fingers leaving scratches in the glass. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the roof. Elena screamed as another figure dropped onto the windshield, its face pressed against the glass. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth moved as if it were trying to speak, but no sound came out. "Get out of the car!" Jack yelled, opening his door and grabbing Elena's arm. They ran into the woods, the creatures following, their guttural growls echoing through the trees. Jack and Elena ran until their lungs burned, but the forest was endless. The creatures were relentless, their pale forms darting between the trees, always just out of reach. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows boarded up and its door hanging off its hinges. It was the only shelter in sight. They ran inside, slamming the door behind them. The cabin was dark and smelled of rot. The floor creaked under their weight, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "I'm waking up now. What are we going to do?" Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Jack admitted. He peeked through a crack in the door. The creatures were circling the cabin, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Suddenly a voice came from the shadows. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jack and Elena spun around. The man from the gas station stood in the corner, his grin wider than ever. How did you get here?" Jack stammered. The man stepped forward, his form twisting and elongating, his skin peeled away, revealing something monstrous beneath, a creature with black, empty eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. "You filled up with my gas," the creature hissed. "Now you belong to the road." The door burst open and the other creatures flooded in. Jack and Elena screamed as the darkness swallowed them whole. The next morning, a highway patrol officer found their car abandoned on the side of the road. The tank was full, but the engine was filled with a thick, tar-like substance. Jack and Elena were never seen again. Jack and Elena were halfway through their cross-country road trip